"If you lay a hand on my daughter, I swear you'll never set foot in this hospital again." The millionaire's voice cut through the hallway like a blade. Even the doctors stepped back. I was there, and to this day, I still feel the weight of that moment, because the man he was threatening didn't show fear, none. He just stood there, staring at the child, as if he were seeing something no one else could see. Then he spoke quietly, but clearly enough to freeze the room. "This girl shouldn't be like this." The silence that followed wasn't normal. It was heavy, uncomfortable, almost as if that sentence had broken something invisible inside that place, because it wasn't just an opinion, it was a statement, a direct challenge to everything the doctors had already concluded. That's when he slipped his hand inside his worn coat, pulled out something wrapped in a piece of cloth, and in the exact second the girl's father saw it, his face completely lost its color. But before I tell you what that man pulled from his pocket that day, you need to understand how everything led up to that moment. My name is Thomas. Today I'm already old, and for many years I kept this story to myself. Not because it's hard to talk about, but because every time someone hears what happened in that hospital, the reaction is always the same. People go silent, as if they're trying to decide whether to believe it or pretend they never heard it. Back then, I worked as a caretaker in one of the most luxurious houses in the city. The owner was Richard Hale, a man who wasn't just rich. He seemed to have control over everything. Giant companies, decisions that moved millions, and a presence that changed any room the moment he walked in. But there was something he couldn't control. For years, Richard and his wife Elena tried to have a child. Appointments, treatments, trips. Money was never the problem, and still nothing happened. I remember nights when the whole house felt too empty. Elena sitting in silence, staring into nothing, and Richard pacing back and forth like someone who refused to lose a battle he didn't understand. Until when there was no hope left, it happened. Elena got pregnant, and everything changed. The house came back to life. Plans, laughter, anticipation, and for the first time, I saw Richard smile without effort. I'll never forget the day he walked in, looked at me, and said almost in a whisper, "This child is a miracle." Months of preparation followed, every detail planned, every exam followed with anxiety. But just hours after the birth, something started to go wrong. At first, it seemed like nothing. The baby was breathing fine. Her heart was strong. Everything seemed normal until the first tests came, then more, and then the looks. Those looks no one wants to understand. The baby didn't respond. No sound, no voice, nothing. They clapped, called her, tested her in every possible way, and nothing. Specialists came. Modern equipment. More tests, more cold answers. Rare neurological condition. No sensory response. No known reversal. I saw a man who controlled everything completely lose his footing in front of a cradle. Richard Hale couldn't buy this. He couldn't fix this. And it was destroying him from the inside. But what no one in that hospital imagined was that the answer wouldn't come from a doctor or technology or money. It would begin the exact moment a man in worn clothes, steady gaze, and an unexplainable calm appeared in that hospital, staring at the child as if he recognized something no one else could see. And when he opened his mouth for the first time, even the doctors felt a chill they couldn't explain. Because before he even showed what was hidden in that cloth, he said something that made the girl's own father doubt everything he thought he knew. And if you feel like this story still hasn't revealed the main point, it's because it hasn't. So if you want to understand what that man pulled from his pocket and why it changed everything, subscribe to the channel, because what happened next, no one there could explain. When that man first appeared at the hospital, no one took him seriously. To the security guards, he was just someone trying to get into a place he didn't belong. To the doctors, an inconvenient distraction in the middle of a delicate case. But to me, something felt off about that situation. Not about him, but about the way he looked at the child. I was leaning near the hallway when he showed up. Worn clothes, shoes marked by time, but his gaze didn't match any of that. It wasn't the look of someone lost. It was the look of someone who knew exactly where he was and why. He walked slowly until he stopped in front of the glass of the room where the girl was. The guards immediately stepped in. "Sir, access here is restricted," one of them said firmly. The man didn't answer. He just tilted his head slightly, observing the baby. Then he murmured something almost inaudible. "She's trying to respond, but no one is listening." I felt a chill at that moment, not because of the word, but because of the conviction. Inside the room, Eleanor was holding her daughter while Richard spoke to yet another specialist who had been urgently called in. It was always the same. A new doctor, a new hope, and the same result. "Mr. Hale, we've reviewed all the tests," the doctor said carefully. "There is no neurological response to auditory stimuli. Richard stayed silent for a few seconds. It wasn't new, but it still hurt, like the first time. "Is there any chance of error?" he asked, trying to stay composed. The doctor hesitated before answering. "With the equipment we used, it's extremely unlikely." Outside, the man kept watching the child, and then something strange happened. The baby, who had been completely unresponsive, slightly moved her head. It was subtle, quick, but not random. I saw it, and the man saw it too. His eyes narrowed for a moment, as if that confirmed something he already suspected. That's when he tried to enter the room. The guards reacted immediately. "Hey, you can't go in!" "I need to speak with the child's father," he said without raising his voice. "That's none of your concern," another guard replied. The man looked straight at him and said something that made even me hold my breath. "It's more than you can imagine." The commotion drew enough attention for Richard to step out of the room, irritated. He was exhausted, tired of diagnoses, vague answers, of having no control over anything. When he saw the man being held, his patience snapped. "What's going on here?" he asked coldly. That's when the stranger looked him straight in the eyes and said without hesitation, "Your daughter wasn't born like this." The entire hallway froze. It wasn't just the sentence, it was how he said it, like someone who wasn't giving an opinion, but stating something he knew. Richard stepped forward. "Do you have any idea how many specialists have examined my daughter?" His voice was controlled, but heavy. The man didn't step back. They looked, but they didn't see. That was enough to break what little patience remained. "If you touch her one more time, I'll make you disappear from this city," Richard replied, eyes locked on him. But what happened next, no one expected. The man didn't react with fear, didn't argue. He simply slipped his hand slowly inside his coat, like someone about to prove something no one there was ready to accept. And before even taking out what was hidden, he said something that made even the most skeptical doctor fall silent for a second. Her problem didn't start in the body. The silence returned, but now it was different. Not just tension, discomfort, doubt. Something was slipping out of the logical boundaries of that situation. Inside the room, Elena appeared at the door, holding the baby. Her eyes were tired, but there was something there that hadn't been before. A fragile, dangerous hope, impossible to ignore. "Richard," she whispered, "what if he's right?" That question changed everything, because for the first time, someone wasn't reacting with logic, but with need. And in that moment, without realizing, they were one step away from allowing something completely beyond reason into that room. And what that man still hadn't shown was exactly what would make everyone there question not just the diagnosis, but everything they believed up to that moment. The hallway fell silent after Elena's question. Not an ordinary silence, but the kind where everything feels about to change, yet no one knows how. Richard looked at his wife, then at the child in her arms, and finally at the man in front of him. It didn't make sense. Nothing did. For days he had trusted the best doctors, the most advanced technology, everything money could bring, and now he stood there, being confronted by someone who had absolutely nothing. And yet, there was something in that man's eyes he couldn't ignore. It wasn't insistence, it was certainty. "If you're wrong," Richard began, voice low but firm, "you will never come near my family again." The man nodded slightly. "And if I'm right, you'll have to listen to what you've avoided for a long time." The answer didn't come in words, but in that moment, something inside Richard gave way. It wasn't trust, it was lack of options. "Let him go," he said at last. The guards hesitated for a second, then obeyed. The man adjusted his coat and walked toward the room. Each step seemed to carry a strange weight, as if that moment had been marked long before it happened. The doctors immediately began to protest. "Mr. Hale, this is irresponsible," one said. "We don't know who he is. This has no basis," added another. But Richard didn't back down. For the first time since it all began, he wasn't choosing the logical path. He was choosing the only one left. Inside the room, the atmosphere changed. Not visibly, but everyone felt it. The air seemed denser, quieter. Elena held her daughter tightly, as if afraid of losing that moment. The man stopped in front of them. He didn't touch the child, didn't speak immediately. He just observed, like someone listening to something no one else could hear. The girl, who had remained distant from every stimulus, slowly moved her eyes toward him, subtle but clear. I saw the exact moment Eleanor noticed. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling. He saw it too, and that was enough to shift something inside him. The man took a deep breath and said calmly, before trying to make her respond, "There's something that must be done first." One of the doctors sighed impatiently. "This makes no sense." But no one interrupted anymore, because now, no one was certain of anything. Richard crossed his arms, still tense. "Then say it." The man looked straight at him. "This girl isn't trapped in silence. She's trapped in something that was left open." The sentence fell into the room like an invisible weight. No one fully understood, but but everyone felt it. "What are you talking about?" Richard asked, no longer as firm as before. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat again and carefully pulled out the object wrapped in the old cloth. This time, he didn't hide it. He slowly unfolded the fabric, revealing a small medallion worn by time. Something simple, old, but carrying a presence no one there could explain. Richard frowned, irritated. "You think that's going to solve anything?" The man lifted his gaze. "This doesn't solve, it reminds." Then he opened the medallion. Inside, there was an old image, almost, a faded, but enough to make time stop for a second in that room, because the moment Richard saw it, something in his face completely changed. It wasn't immediate surprise. It was recognition, deep, unsettling, like a memory buried for years, now being pulled forcefully back to the surface. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out lower than he expected. The man answered without looking away. "I didn't get it. I kept it." The silence that followed was different from all the others. Now there was something no one could ignore. Past, connection, and a question forming inside everyone that no one dared to ask out loud. The man took a step closer to the child and said something that made even the doctors lose any argument in that moment. "Before the miracle comes the decision," and what he was about to ask, no one in that room was ready to accept. The room stood still after that. His sentence, "Before the miracle there comes the decision," it wasn't advice. It was a boundary, something that had to happen before anything else. Richard still stared at the open medallion in the man's hands. The image inside wasn't clear to everyone, but for Richard it was impossible not to recognize. A small church, simple, old, and a memory he had spent years avoiding. "This has nothing to do with my daughter," he said, trying to regain control, but even his voice couldn't hold its firmness. The man didn't confront him. He simply replied calmly, "It has more to do with it than you want to admit." Elena, still holding the baby, looked from one to the other, not fully understanding, but feeling that something much bigger was being exposed. "Richard, what is that?" she asked carefully. He took a few seconds to answer, as if each word had to pass through something stuck inside him. "It's a place I knew many years ago." The man nodded slightly. "It wasn't just a place. It's where you asked for something, when you had nothing left." Silence returned, now heavy with memory. I saw the exact moment it truly hit Richard. His eyes changed. The body that once seemed ready to react to any threat was now still. "This has nothing to do with this," he insisted softer. "I built everything myself." The man slowly shook his head. "That's what you started to believe." The words weren't accusatory, but impossible to ignore. Elena stepped forward. "Richard, what is he talking about?" He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he spoke, he didn't sound like the same man anymore. "I made a promise," he said, almost in a whisper. The air in the room shifted again, not visibly, but everyone felt it. Even the doctors, who had been ready to interrupt, now stayed silent. "When everything was going wrong, I went to that place," he continued, struggling, "and asked for a chance, just one, and I said that if I made it out of that situation, I wouldn't forget who brought me through it." Elena slowly covered her mouth. "And you forgot," she completed without realizing. Richard didn't answer, but his silence was enough. The man gently closed the medallion. Some things don't disappear when ignored. They stay, waiting for the right moment. Richard ran a hand over his face, shaken. For the first time since it all began, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked like someone confronted by something he couldn't negotiate. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. The man looked at the child, then at Elena, then back at Richard. "Acknowledge not what you achieved, but who sustained you when you had nothing." The request wasn't complicated, but the weight was enormous, because it didn't require money or power. It required something Richard had left behind long ago. Surrender. Eleanor stepped closer. "If there's any chance," she said, voice breaking, "we need to do this. Not for us, for her." The baby remained quiet, but her eyes were open, attentive, as if something in that room was finally reaching her somehow. Richard looked at his daughter, and something inside him finally gave way. Without saying anything, he stepped forward, and for the first time, he bowed his head. It wasn't a rehearsed prayer. It wasn't beautiful. It was simple, raw. "I don't know how to do this right," he began, voice low, "but I know I couldn't do it alone." The silence in the room shifted, lighter, deeper, as if something had finally aligned. The man watched everything without interrupting, like someone who knew that moment was the turning point. Elena closed her eyes too, holding the child against her chest, and for the first time since the birth, there was no despair in that gesture. There was surrender. The man stepped forward. "Now, we're ready." He slowly raised his hand toward the child, and in that exact instant, before even touching her, something began to change so subtly that almost no one noticed at first, because what was about to happen wouldn't begin with the touch, but with something that had already been released before that moment. And if If you've made it this far, maybe it's because something in this story has already made you remember things you left behind. So subscribe to the channel, because what happens next goes beyond what anyone in that room was prepared to explain. As the man's hand moved closer to the girl's head, no one breathed properly. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was as if the air itself had grown heavier in that room. The doctors were tense, waiting for any sign to intervene, the guards alert, but no one moved, because something in that moment prevented any reaction. Richard stood still. There was no more threat, no control, no resistance, just a father waiting. The man didn't touch the child immediately. First, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if listening to something that didn't come from that place. Then, with extreme calm, he gently placed his hand on the girl's head. No sound, no immediate effect, just silence, a different silence, deep almost. Alive, seconds began to pass. 1, 2, 3, and nothing. One of the doctors was already starting to move, ready to stop it, but right then, something changed. The girl moved her fingers, lightly, almost imperceptible, but not random. Elena noticed first. Richard, her voice faltered, filled with something between fear and hope. The man kept his hand steady, eyes still closed. Then he murmured so softly it barely seemed to belong there. What was not made for silence does not remain in it. A small metallic sound echoed in the room. A tray, carelessly left, vibrated slightly on the table beside them. It was simple, normal, but in that moment, nothing was normal, because the girl's head moved, slowly, but with direction. She turned toward the sound. At first, no one reacted. It was as if the mind refused to accept what the eyes were seeing. One doctor frowned, trying to find a quick explanation, but before he could say anything, it happened again. One of the machines beside the bed emitted a soft beep, and again, the child's head moved, this time faster, clearer. Elena covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. She's hearing. Richard didn't respond. He couldn't. The man slowly opened his eyes and said one more sentence. Silence has no place here anymore. He removed his hand from the girl's head and stepped back slightly. That's when Richard, still in shock, said almost without a voice, "Elena, talk to her." The mother stepped closer, trembling. Each step carried years of pain. She looked at her daughter, took a deep breath and said, her voice breaking, "My daughter." The sound of her voice filled the room. And then it happened. The girl immediately turned her face toward her mother's voice, without hesitation, without doubt, like someone finally recognizing something that had always been there. And then she smiled. Not a reflex, not by chance. A clear, directed, living smile. Elena dropped to her knees, crying. One doctor held his head, repeating in shock, this can't. Another couldn't even speak. Richard, the man who never showed weakness, began to cry right there without trying to hide it. But what left everyone even more speechless was what happened next. Because when Richard finally turned, trying to find the man who had touched his daughter, he realized something no one expected. The room was exactly as before. The doctors, Elena, the child, everything in place except him. The man was gone. No sound of a door, no footsteps in the hallway, nothing, as if he had simply disappeared. But before they could understand what that meant, something even more unsettling began to take hold of that moment, because the miracle had already happened. But the question that remained was far greater than the healing. Who was that man, and how did he know exactly what needed to be done? For a few seconds, no one could move. The room was still filled with the impact of what had just happened. The girl continued, responding to sounds, turning her head with every small noise, as if discovering the world for the first time. Elena remained on her knees, crying, but now it wasn't despair. It was relief, gratitude, something beyond words. Richard took a little longer to move. His eyes were still fixed on his daughter, as if afraid everything would vanish if he blinked. But when he finally turned, the emptiness where the man should have been hit him differently. Where did he go? He asked, almost whispering. No one answered, because no one had seen him leave. I stepped into the hallway, looked both ways. Nothing, no sign, as if he had never been there. And that was what affected all of us the most, because it wasn't just the miracle, it was the disappearance. Richard ran his hand over his face, still trying to process everything. Then, as if something had clicked inside him, he slowly looked into his own coat pocket. He pulled something out and stayed silent for a few seconds. It was the medallion, the same one. But that wasn't the most astonishing part. What froze him was the fact that he didn't remember taking it back. He opened it slowly, and when he saw the image, his eyes filled with tears again. That's not awesome, he murmured. Elena stepped closer, still holding the child. What is it? He took a deep breath before answering. This medallion, I gave it to someone many years ago. Silence returned, now full of meaning, because it confirmed something no one there wanted to say out loud. The man hadn't appeared by chance. He was never lost. He knew exactly where where to go and when to arrive. Richard carefully closed the medallion as if holding something sacred. For the first time, there was no doubt in his eye, only understanding. "I made a promise," he said, looking at his daughter, "and I forgot." Elena rested her head on his shoulder. "But you remembered before it was too late." The girl let out a small sound, almost like a soft laugh, and both of them smiled at the same time, still emotional. Days passed, but that moment never left the minds of anyone who had been in that hospital. The girl grew up hearing perfectly, every sound, every word, every detail of the world that once seemed distant. But the greatest change wasn't in her, it was in Richard. He remained a businessman. He kept building, leading, but never the same way again. Because now there was something above all of that. He returned to the place in the photograph, the small church. He restored it, helped people, not out of obligation, but because he finally understood what had been done for him long before all of this. And as for me, I learned something I carry to this day. The miracle doesn't always begin when we see it. Sometimes it begins much earlier, in something we promised and forgot. And maybe you're hearing this story now, not by chance, but because there's something you also left behind, something still waiting to be remembered. Because in that hospital, on that day, it wasn't just a child who learned to hear, it was a man who learned to understand again. And if this story made you reflect, if at any moment you felt something greater happening behind it all, subscribe to the channel, because some stories aren't told just to impress, but to awaken something we often try to ignore.